We were minutes from takeoff when it happened. The cabin smelled like reheated coffee and jet fuel, the kind of smell that makes you nostalgic and nervous at the same time. My wife and I had boarded early, claimed our seats, and settled into what had become a small ritual for us. She always took the window seat, I took the aisle, and we traded tiny observations about clouds and life as the world shrank into a strip of runway. Across the aisle sat a woman with the kind of entitlement that announces itself before she speaks. She had the posture of someone who expects things to bend around her, the clipped tone of someone who believes rules were made for other people, and a scarf that cost more than 1 month of rent for the coffee shop down the street. People call that type Karen. We all know one. Today she was especially volatile. There was a standoff about luggage, a muttered exchange when overhead bins became contested real estate. The flight attendant attempted to play diplomat, the kind of pleasant, practiced smile used to paper over friction with the polite force of customer service. My wife leaned over and offered to help the woman lift a bag into the bin. She did it with that casual kindness she does, the kind that surprises people because it's authentic and not performative. That should have been the end of it. Instead, the woman leaned too close, hissed something about entitlement, and before anyone could fully process the sentence, she reached for a paper cup of coffee. My wife had a paper cup too, half empty, and Karen, because the plane gave us a Karen, swung and dumped her hot coffee all over my wife's hands, lap, and the side of her face. There was a beat of stunned silence, time condensed into one elongated second where my brain sorted through disbelief, indignation, and an old, slow fury that isn't personal so much as principled. You don't throw hot liquids at people, you don't humiliate another human being in public, and then sit back like it's an Olympic event. People gasped. The flight attendant rushed over. Napkins were produced in a flurry of soft paper. My wife sat there, drinking in pain and confusion. Her blouse was ruined, her hands reddened from the heat, but she also had that look, the one that comes before a laugh when something so absurd and grotesque happens you almost can't decide whether to cry or smile. I stood up. My first instinct was to check on her, to make sure she was okay, to hold her wrist and tell her it was going to be fine. My second instinct was older and quieter, a lawyery instinct, an ownership instinct, not because I'm proud of it, but because there are parts of who I am that were built on systems and leverage. I own things. I own a lot of things. 62 airports to be exact. Yes, 62. Not a flex, just context. Some people inherit, some people build, some people get lucky, and some people spend decades learning how to make the pieces fit together. Airports are strange organisms. They're half city, half theater, half logistics hub, and wholly a place where millions of human narratives intersect every single day. Owning airports taught me patience, taught me about leverage, and taught me the inconvenient reality that power, used well, can be surgical and quiet. I put my hand on my wife's shoulder and it steadied her. "Are you okay?" I asked. Her voice was small but swift. "I am. She just..." "Why would she..." There was a tremor, not just from pain, but from the violation, the flight attendant asked. "For our statements, for witness accounts." A manager offered to speak with the other passenger in the jetway when we landed. People suggested that we file a complaint with the airline, maybe even press charges. There were calls for dramatic action. But I had another plan, one that used the loopholes of civility rather than the blunt instrument of fury. Later, when we deplaned, calm had returned to the plastic seats in the overhead bins. The woman, Karen, walked off with that same brisk step, like she had won something. She didn't look back. People like that rarely do. Back at the terminal, my wife and I sat on a bench under fluorescent lights, and I listened as she described the searing pain, the sharp sting of humiliation, and the weird, small kindness of strangers who offered tissues and condolences. She wanted to go home, to change clothes, to scrub the coffee stain out of her favorite blouse. She wanted the physical comfort of a shower and the larger comfort of justice, even if justice in her mind was only a stern word or an apology. "I want her to be embarrassed," she said quietly, half whisper, half wish. "I want her to know what it's like to stand where I stood." There are many ways to make people understand. There are also many dangers in making them understand. Public shaming can become cruelty. Revenge can mutate into obsession. I promised I'd do something, not because of pride, not out of malice, but because boundaries matter and because people believing they can get away with assault in public should feel the consequences. The thing about owning airports is simple. Airports are small cities that revolve around rules, access, and reputations. They have their own security, their own codes, their own customer experience philosophies, and they keep records, Everything from boarding histories to frequent flyer profiles to security logs. They are places where a pattern leaves traces. If someone behaves recklessly in one airport, chances are it's happened somewhere else, because entitlement likes to travel. I did the boring adult thing first. I reached out to the airline. I provided the flight number, the seat information, and an account of what happened. I asked for the incident to be recorded. I requested the airline to look into their boarding video, their incident reports, and to reach out to the woman to request a statement. I did not threaten. I offered cooperation. If she had a medical emergency, we would help. If she had a lapse in judgment, we wanted to document it. The airline was professional, the kind of efficiency honed by regular exposure to chaos. But there was more I wanted to do. I wanted a response calibrated to the offense, not petty, but proportionate. I also wanted the message to be clear. Assault, even a petty kind like spilled coffee, has consequences. So where a regular passenger might have filed a complaint and let the system take its slow route, I used what I had learned about corridors and levers. I called a friend who manages corporate security across several of my airports. He knows how to handle incidents with tact. He knows when to escalate and when to document. He knows the machines that talk to each other and the people who answer to them. He knew exactly what I needed without me having to explain much. A careful inquiry into whether the woman in question had a history of disruptive behavior across the network and whether she had any pending security flags. We didn't wait for public spectacle. We did not park a camera on her doorstep or leak her name online. That's not my style. What we did was surgical. We pulled the public records that are appropriate for private security teams, checked the airline's report, and coordinated with the airline's customer relations to make sure there was a record. We requested that, should this individual appear in any of our airports, she be flagged for enhanced attention, and if necessary, for exclusion from lounge privileges or access that requires good conduct. We also did something else. Because airports are hubs of stories, I wanted to create a teaching moment that felt like consequence and not cruelty. I arranged, through proper channels, for a senior customer experience manager to reach out to the woman on behalf of the airline. The manager would explain the gravity of throwing hot coffee at another passenger. The manager would make clear the airline's policy and the potential for charges. The manager would ask for an apology. Sometimes the fix is an apology. Sometimes it is restitution. Sometimes it's a ban. Within 48 hours, the airline called back with evidence, boarding camera footage that caught the coffee toss, statements from the flight crew, and a note that the woman had admitted fault when questioned by airline staff. She had claimed stress, a medical flare-up, a sudden heat. There was an apology, shaky and defensive, that read more like a reflex than a transform. The airline issued a formal reprimand, temporarily suspended her boarding privileges pending a final customer review, and offered assistance to my wife for the damages and medical care that satisfied many people. It satisfied my wife for a moment, the way a plaster calms before the wound fully heals. She received compensation, both financial and procedural, but she wanted more. She wanted to see an eyebrow raise, a contrition. She wanted validation that what had happened mattered. So we took the high road. We didn't go on social media. We didn't record a viral video. Instead, on the next flight out for my wife, the captain made an announcement that would have made airline PR teams clap, a short, firm reminder about civility on board, about the sanctity of personal space, and about the zero-tolerance policy for assault. It was funny enough to be human, stern enough to be clear. People tuned in, they shifted in their seats and whispered approvingly. The message landed. What surprised me, more than the airline's swift action, was another ripple. A woman who had been sitting 3 rows back approached my wife at the gate and said, "I saw exactly what happened. I was going to say something on the plane, but I thought, who am I? I'm just a stranger." She had recorded the flight number, saved the airline's contact, and called later to provide her witness account. She told my wife her own story of being bullied in public spaces and how it had taught her to stand up. There is power in the witness. There's also power in the quiet way things accumulate. The woman who threw coffee had a record now, not only with the airline but in the stories of people who had watched. That matters. Stories are how the world remembers. A week later, an unexpected letter arrived at my office. It was from a woman representing the woman who had thrown the coffee. The letter contained an earnest apology, an offer to pay for cleaning and medical bills, and a request to speak privately to make amends. She claimed she had been under unusual stress, had snapped, and wanted to make it right. My wife and I read it together. I could see the wheels turning in her head, the calculus of whether to accept and close the chapter or to push for more. She chose the path that most fit her nature. She accepted the apology, told the woman she forgave her, and suggested a way to make amends that felt constructive rather than performative. My wife asked that, instead of a public spectacle, the woman volunteer with a community program that helps people with emotional regulation and conflict resolution at our local airport outreach center. She asked for something that would cost time, not money, because that tends to be more revealing of intent. The woman agreed. She volunteered. She showed up. She was awkward at first, as most people are, when the reality of making amends meets the friction of human discomfort. She learned, stumbling through lessons on empathy and accountability, that apologies that aren't tied to action feel hollow. She cleaned up the stain on my wife's blouse too, like a small ritual of restitution. We could have burned it down. We could have thrown names into the public square and watched the crowd feast. But there's a difference between justice and spectacle. We chose consequence and repair. That taught me something about the kind of power I wanted to wield. Having airports meant I could enact broad strokes, cancellations, bans, protocols, but the real test is what you do with that power. On a human scale, do you use it to humiliate? To humiliate is easy. To educate and restore takes work. There's humor in the aftermath too. After everything's settled, a mutual friend joked that owning 62 airports was the best passive-aggressive flex. You should have just announced over the intercom, "Karen, you have 24 hours to apologize." We laughed, but my wife looked at me and said, "No, that would have been too much. We didn't want her broken. We wanted her changed." I tell you all this not to paint myself as some noble guardian, but because these are the small moral choices that determine what kind of person you are when you have resources. It's tempting to let your anger do the work for you, to let public humiliation be your method of enforcement. I am not immune to that temptation. But the airports taught me an economy of consequences. Choose the result you want and work backwards. If you want education, create a program. If you want accountability, make a record. If you want restitution, ask for repair. If you want cruelty, shout into the void and watch it echo. Months later, I visited one of the outreach programs where the woman who had thrown coffee now volunteered. She stood in front of a small group of travelers and told a story about losing her temper on a plane, about how she'd been forced to look at the ripple effects of a moment that had cost someone else dignity and scarred someone else's hands. The group listened. They exchanged stories. My wife and I sat in the back, unnoticed, and watched as a small, ugly moment was turned towards something useful. My wife recovered. Her hands healed, the blouse was mended, and the story became one of those odd landmarks in our marriage. A story we tell sometimes at dinner, the way other couples tell the story of the day their car broke down on a foggy highway and they had to push it to safety. It became a story about how we handled anger, about civility in public spaces, about the work of transforming harm into responsibility. There are practical takeaways. If you get coffee thrown on you, clean immediately with cool water, seek medical attention for burns, and document everything. If you are in a public space and witness aggression, speak up if you can safely do so. And if you have power, consider using it to make repair accessible rather than to elevate spectacle. But there's also a softer lesson that sits alone in the way a late flight sits under a midnight sky. Power without purpose is merely privilege. Owning airports taught me how to move crowds and cargo, how to set norms and build infrastructure. But what it also taught me was how to answer the quieter question, what will you stand for? I chose to stand for repair. When people ask why I didn't publicly humiliate her, I say that humiliation is a fast burn and an empty one. It feeds the mob for a night and leaves nothing after except ash. Consequence that leads to change is slow. It requires patience, it requires logistics, and sometimes it requires that you let systems do their jobs while you make sure they work. The day the woman came back to the outreach center with a report of her first month of volunteer hours, she showed up without scarves and without the costume of entitlement. She looked smaller, not in the way cruelty shrinks someone, but in the way that recognition and effort make you less grandiose and thus more human. She apologized in front of the group, this time not as defense but as admission. The group accepted it, not as absolution but as a step. My wife hugged her afterward. It was a small moment. She whispered something I couldn't hear and walked away with a smile that had the kind of relief only real forgiveness can give. In the end, owning 62 airports was not a shield and it was not a cudgel, it was context. The story that matters is how we respond to the small violences that cross our thresholds. It could have been a viral video, a headline, an act of vengeance that made strangers cheer for an hour. Instead, it was a quiet, steady application of consequence and education that changed behavior and, in a small way, made an airport community safer. The moral, perhaps, is this: when someone tries to redefine your life with an act of petty violence, you have options. You can shout into the void and let the void shout back. Or you can build a bridge across the void and invite the person who burned it to walk across it with you. That doesn't erase the harm. It just points toward a future where people know better and, more importantly, act better. As for Karen, she travels less now, at least through our airports. She made her peace, paid her dues, and in time became a volunteer who, oddly, now helps people practice the phrase, "I'm sorry," until it stops being a rumor and becomes a practice. My wife and I tell the story occasionally, not as a souvenir of triumph, but as a reminder. Civility is not guaranteed. It must be defended. And where possible, it should be taught. We still take the window seat. We still watch the world shrink and reappear. Sometimes we remark about clouds, sometimes about passengers, and sometimes about the peculiar way life arranges a lesson when all you want is a quiet flight. The day coffee was thrown is one of those lessons. It was messy then, and it's still messy in the memory, but it left us with something better than revenge. A story about how to use power to repair, and how sometimes owning 62 airports is less about having lots of keys and more about knowing which doors to open.